Was there anyone who tried to warn us about something that happened, but we didn't listen? Who? In 2005, Courtney Love was asked what advice she'd give to young up-and-coming actresses. She said, "If Harvey Weinstein invites you to a private party at his Four Seasons hotel room, don't go." And for whatever reason, you didn't see her in many movies after that. Didn't Cameron Diaz also make a similar statement on a talk show? It was well known that Weinstein was a creep. It just wasn't well known how much of a creep he really was. Whitney Cummings also joked about it in a roast once, and there was a 30 Rock joke also making fun of Weinstein. It's like how everyone knew that Kevin Spacey was gay and liked younger guys, but no one knew the full extent. French General Ferdinand Foch reportedly called the Treaty of Versailles a 20-year armistice, i.e. not conducive to lasting peace. World War II broke out approximately 20 years later. Ignaz Semmelweis is often described as the father of hand-washing. In the 1800s, he discovered that infant maternal mortality could be drastically reduced by doctors washing their hands between patients. He was largely ignored, and his book got absolutely slated. This is supposed to have contributed to him having a mental breakdown, and he died in a psychiatric hospital, not just between patients, between working on cadavers and delivering babies. Rick Rescorla, director of corporate security for Morgan Stanley Dean Witter, published a report in 1990 detailing the vulnerability of the World Trade Center parking garage. He and a colleague found that they were able to freely walk into the garage, which contained many structural support columns, unchallenged by any security. Additionally, no ID checks or screening was done on any of the entering delivery trucks. 3 years later, a truck bomb was driven into the garage and detonated in an attempt to damage the structure of the building. Later, he and a same colleague would correctly predict the next attack on the building would come from the air. The evacuation plan and drills he put in place are credited with saving over 2,600 lives on September 11th. Rick died helping people get out on 9/11. One of the last people to see him said, "You need to get out too." He said something like, "I will," but he didn't make it. I worked for Morgan Stanley then, but in Houston. I had colleagues in the towers that day, including my best friend. Watching the towers fall on TV, we thought there was no way everyone made it out, but all my local people made it out. Of 3,800 MS employees at World Trade, just 13 perished thanks to crazy luck and Rick. He's a goddamn hero. I'll never forget him. President George Washington, in his address when leaving office, he warned against the danger of a two-party system in future politics. He felt that several parties on equal footing would be better, especially in presidential elections. The more legitimate choices, the better. Eisenhower and the military-industrial complex, too. Pearl Jam warned us about Ticketmaster years ago. Nobody listened, and now we're stuck with them. And only them. The sad thing is, when I bought my tickets to see Pearl Jam at Hyde Park in July via Ticketmaster, I'm sure someone can explain this much better than I can, but I think Pearl Jam has something in their contract with Ticketmaster that makes it so scalpers can't buy their tickets. They couldn't change Ticketmaster as a whole, but they at least made things a little better for their own fans. I have a foreboding of an America in my children's or grandchildren's time, when the United States is a service and information economy, when nearly all the manufacturing industries have slipped away to other countries, when awesome technological powers are in the hands of a very few and no one representing the public interest can even grasp the issues, when the people have lost the ability to set their own agendas or knowledgeably question those in authority, when clutching our crystals and nervously consulting our horoscopes, our critical faculties in decline, unable to distinguish between what feels good and what's true, we slide, almost without noticing, back into superstition and darkness. The dumbing down of America is most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media. The 30-second sound bites, now down to 10 seconds or less, lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially a kind of celebration of ignorance. Carl Sagan. How prescient. I work in broadcast media, and the number of commercial breaks created/stuffed into a program to cover all the sales inventory and promos is crazy. I think we've really created a sort of ADHD in the whole country with this style of TV. Those 30-second sound bites, as he calls them, it's such a big part of the business now, it'll never change. Attention spans adjusted. Now it's all about 15-second TikTok videos. In another 10 years, where will we be? Watching 10-minute videos on YouTube, 2007 era, is what I grew up on. Now it's all about 10-second videos. Even on Reddit, r/videos was a prominent front-page sub in 2011, but now it doesn't see the light of day. It's increasingly about sensational clickbait and gut reactions. It was bad in 2011, and it's so much worse now. 12 TRW engineers resigned their positions the morning of the Challenger incident in protest against risking the flight. NASA launched anyway. Should have listened. I genuinely did not know this, but it puts the tragedy in an entirely different light for me. I highly recommend listening to the You're Wrong About podcast episode about the Challenger. Maybe it was because I was in Florida when it happened, but it was a huge deal in our school system. I watched live as a 4th grader. Basically, it was quite preventable, and they went the duct tape and cardboard route instead of quality and safety. Line a few coffins, line a few pockets. H.G. Wells said he wanted his epitaph to be, "I told you so, you damned fools." In The Land Ironclads, 1903, he wrote about a stalemated war fought by trench warfare that was broken by the invention of tanks, predicting what would happen in World War I. In The War in the Air, 1907, he predicted how airplanes would be used in war, including aerial bombardment of cities, and saw his predictions come true in World War II. Harry Markopolos notified the SEC 3 times that whatever Bernie Madoff was doing wasn't legit and should be investigated, and all 3 times he was ignored. He talks about it in his book No One Would Listen. Check it out if you want to see a real facepalm example of government incompetence. Bismarck warned the ruling German monarch of his time that Germany's status in Europe and the relative peace of the continent would only last a short time. After his forced resignation, Bismarck said, "Jena came 20 years after the death of Frederick the Great. The crash will come 20 years after my departure if things go on like this." 20 years later, Germany lost World War I and almost collapsed. Harry Markopolos. He figured out what Madoff was up to, and the SEC still blew him off for years, presumably because the proof he was presenting required math to understand. Harry's motivations really spoke to me. His boss said, "Hey, I need you to invent a financial product exactly like the one that this Madoff character is selling. He is taking a lot of our customers." Harry went on to use math to prove it was either one of 2 things. Front-running, where if you are a market maker and you have a list of orders from your clients, you can sneak your orders in just before since you know it will change the price right after. This does not scale to the levels Madoff was claiming as profits to his clients, but at the time, it was considered an option. They did not know how much he was claiming he was profiting across all his investors. The second possibility was just a straight-up Ponzi scheme. He told his boss it was not mathematically possible to do what Madoff was doing, and the boss blew him off because he thought Harry just didn't want to work hard enough to make a similar product to what Madoff was doing. The guy uncovered the largest fraud in history to stop his boss from asking him to do an impossible task. Every single junior officer working in Afghanistan for the last 20 years universally called the ANA a worthless POS army and their government a hollow dead money pit. I came home so disillusioned, it seemed like we took warlords and called them governors and said, "Yay democracy!" The media contributed a lot to the lie too. I was in Afghanistan doing light reconnaissance with the Air Force during the 2014 elections. We were basically bouncing from one TIC to the next all over the country until we ran out of gas and had to come home. Get back to BAF and check the news to see the right-wing, left-wing, and even neutral media touting the Afghan elections as a huge success and that they went off without a hitch. It wasn't just the junior officers. Any troop that went to Afghanistan after the mid-2000s knew that we were fighting a losing battle. It didn't matter if we stayed there for 20 more years or 200 more years, it was going to go back to how it was before we got there. You don't change Afghanistan. While not to the degree that it ended up being, but Eddie Murphy took a shot at Bill Cosby's holier-than-thou attitude in his comedy special Raw in 1987 during the height of The Cosby Show. Hannibal Buress, the stand-up comedian, had a joke in his act that talked about Bill Cosby years before it really came out. It was an open secret in the stand-up community. That was no joke. He stopped for a moment and just told the truth. Seth MacFarlane has made fun of sleazy people in Hollywood for years before the Me Too movement. "Help! I've just escaped Kevin Spacey's house!" said Stewie, running naked through a crowd of people. Spacey's basement, but yes, I remember that one too. In college, this was like in '92, my Muslim roommate and I were watching something on TV about Osama bin Laden, and he said, "This guy is determined to accomplish an attack on American soil, and it's going to happen in the next 10 years. At the time, I thought he was crazy. That would be a death sentence for anyone. I told him I'd give him all the money in my bank account if that ever happened. I was so sure. Yeah, we all should have been listening to the warning signs back then. Didn't the US intelligence basically know it was coming but screw up with acting on it? The US Department of Homeland Security was founded after 9/11 because several different agencies collectively had the information that could have stopped the attack, but they didn't work together or communicate effectively. David Attenborough and I don't think we are listening. Well, certainly not doing enough. Oil and coal companies are both spending a lot of money convincing people through their politicians that climate change is a hoax and spending a lot of money to prepare for the ramifications of climate change. The financial crisis that was given by economist Anna Schwartz in 2005. She warned that a housing bubble was developing and that it would lead to financial crisis, but her warnings were largely ignored. Johnny Rotten attempting to warn people about Jimmy Savile. Cassandra of Troy was pretty spot on about that wooden horse. Cassandra had the gift of accurately predicting the future, and the curse that no one would believe her. You've got to admire the sheer level of spite and imagination that the Greek gods could muster. Jason Salemi, an epidemiologist at USF. No one knows him. That's cool. I was working on medical ML research, glioblastoma at the time, and was asked to help analyze some data about a new virus in China. In the middle of January, we had a research meeting and Dr. Salemi said, "I don't like this one. I have a bad feeling about SARS-CoV, as it was then called." On Feb 2020, I was put full-time on the SARS-CoV-2 team. The rest is history. People thought he was being an alarmist. We had recently been through a pair of Ebola outbreaks in Africa, a couple of bad flu seasons, etc. People thought it would blow over. I remember when the news first started breaking of a new virus in China. I saw a post on here where a guy was saying that based on the limited data at the time, it was possible it could become a global pandemic, and the post was downvoted and called fear-mongering. Sinead O'Connor. Then we called her crazy and mocked her for 2 decades. Lots of experts warned about the FTX fraud. The writing was on the wall. Idiots chose to ignore the red flags and made huge investments. Common people were lured in by the perceived trust. There are people, like me, screaming that Tether is exactly the same and it's still freaking there with the better part of 100 billion in assets. Tether is not backed with real assets, and when it explodes, crypto will be in some real big crap. TLC warned us about chasing waterfalls, but based on my Instagram feed, I swear it's fallen on deaf ears. Tried to tell my mom she was sick 5 years ago. Miss you, Mom. Same. Had her convinced to go to the hospital on Wednesday. Sister talked her out of it. Thursday she went, but had to leave due to sitting so long in the waiting room. She suffered from chronic pain. Friday, her home nurse ignored the fact that she couldn't get blood pressure to register, that she was confused, and that her skin was turning yellow. Saturday, I got home. I had left Wednesday night for business, and she was in the hospital. I sat with her until I had to go home to leave Sunday morning. She died that Sunday from sepsis due to an untreated UTI that moved to her kidney and then her blood. Billy Mitchell. He predicted a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in the 1920s and warned the Navy that they needed to spend more money on air defenses and less on ships. The guy who predicted the levees would collapse in a strong hurricane. Category 2 or 3, not 5 as they predicted. He knew the tide surges would destroy New Orleans and predicted it would be down to 1% of deaths, damage, destruction, and water damage. No one believed him, and he had a computer simulation and printouts he tried to show Congress, and tried to tell them to prepare for the worst, including tents for shelter. He was laughed at and later fired, 2 years before Katrina. To secede from the Union and set up another government would cause war. If you go to war with the United States, you will never conquer her, as she has the money and the men. If she does not whip you with the guns, powder, and steel, she will starve you to death. It will take the flower of the country, the young men. Sam Houston, who fought vigorously against the secession, and as governor of Texas at the time, was thrown out of office, and another pro-Confederate governor was installed by the legislature in 1861. Fellow citizens, in the name of your rights and liberties, which I believe have been trampled on, I refuse to take this oath. In the name of the nationality of Texas, which has been betrayed by the convention, I refuse to take this oath. In the name of the Constitution of Texas, I refuse to take this oath. In the name of my own conscience and manhood, which this convention would degrade by dragging me before it to pander to the malice of my enemies, I refuse to take this oath. I deny the power of this convention to speak for Texas. I protest against all the acts and doings of this convention, and I declare them null and void. He was a very conflicted person with some of the highest highs in American history, while at other times dredging up some of the lowest lows, usually entirely due to his own failings and weaknesses. Saint and sinner all in one. They were building a big baseball stadium in Wisconsin, and it was a considerably windy day. The crane operator was tasked with lifting a large structure but refused, stating dangerous gusts. The site foreman dismissed the crane operator and called in one who would do the job with no pushback, while the crane tipped over with a load, and the workers were killed. Foreman and second operator were arrested, and the first operator won a wrongful termination lawsuit. Climate activists have been warning us for quite some time, and I think we as a collective will be looked down on from future generations for not doing enough. Just a thought. Al Gore is still basically the butt of a joke after all this time. South Park actually apologized to him by running an episode where the threat of Man-Bear Pig proved to be very real. UK here. Repeated warnings from anyone and everyone that knew what they were talking about that Brexit was a bad idea. And oh look, it's massively hurting in multiple areas, and a majority of people now think it was a bad idea. The guy in the viral video who said, "Leave Britney alone." George Carlin was basically a prophet about a lot of what he says. Carlin was super insightful about human nature, just like The Simpsons. My gut tried to warn my stupid ass about working with the people I'm working with on my bachelor's thesis. The project got terminated today, and now I have to do it again alone, as my gut told me I should have just done it from the beginning. Edward R. Murrow warned us about the dangers of the television medium being used mainly for entertainment, and how this would lead to an ill-informed population. There is usually some warning that a person is going to commit a mass shooting. I swear almost every time that crap happens, it comes out later that the shooter was known to the FBI. Isaac Asimov in 1980. There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there always has been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, natured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. One of NASA's engineers warned them that Challenger would explode due to frozen O-rings. They ignored him and launched anyway. That Chinese doctor in Wuhan is the first that comes to mind. Mitt Romney warned that Russia was the enemy of peace. He was laughed at by both Republicans and Democrats. I came here specifically to find this comment. Mitt Romney was right about a lot of things, most notably this one. He correctly identified that Russia has a strategic interest in pushing back against the West and trying to revive the old Soviet Empire, and that Putin would be willing to do almost anything to that end. Romney was ridiculed, but he was a visionary who was able to see what so many others didn't want to at the time. Michael Moore and many on the left warned that Hillary would lose to Trump. Mothman warned about the bridge collapse. In 2002, I heard Scott Ritter, former chief weapons inspector for the UN, explicitly say there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but we seem to be invading them anyway soon, and he was 100% right. Corey Feldman was on The View or something and tried to tell people that Hollywood is full of predators, and the hosts just laughed at him and tried to make him feel guilty about outing them. John Kenneth Galbraith. I haven't read his book, The Affluent Society, but from what I've heard, some of the warnings laid out about the direction of US society were largely on point and still relevant today. He foreshadows the environment movement and the culture around frivolous consumption and argues that there is a severe lack of investment in people. Bear in mind, this was back in the late 50s. Alice Stewart, in 1958, discovered the link between X-rays of pregnant women and childhood cancer. She discovered that cancer mortality was around 40% higher in the children who had been X-rayed in the womb. Her findings were considered unsound for another 25 years until after her formal retirement, when they were reviewed due to her continuing to push the issue. It wasn't until the 1980s that X-rays of pregnant women stopped being commonplace. I cannot find the clip, but about a year ago, at a crypto conference, a guy went on stage and publicly said that FTX was a huge fraud and we would all see. Lots of people knew that Brexit was a stupid idea, but they were ignored. And surprise, surprise, it's a crap show. Bill Hicks warned us about Bush Jr. and the war in the Middle East. Then he died shortly after. Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex taking over politics, and we didn't listen. Now military and mega-corporations have completely taken over every aspect of politics. This question reminds me of Al Gore. He was kicking up a fuss about climate change for years. He even made an appearance on South Park regarding it. Now people are actually realizing he might have had a point. Ted Kaczynski in his manifesto. Besides all of the violence and killings, what's outlined in industrial society and its future is pretty bang on. Smart guy who definitely took the wrong approach. Burry tried warning everyone about the housing bubble in '08. Coincidentally enough, he's currently warning everyone about the coming financial collapse, and the same amount of people are listening. Edward Snowden with the NSA. The public didn't care because they A. didn't understand, and B. weren't suffering any direct consequences. If you took a straw poll of people you meet in your everyday life, I'd bet that most people couldn't even accurately describe what Snowden did and why it's important. Dolphins. So long, and thanks for all the fish. People aren't going to like this answer, but 2 entire generations have tried warning the youth for decades about social media. They were told that they were wrong and that they were just jealous because they were old. Well, here we are. Science has concluded social media is 100% rotting our brains and destroying our attention spans. The boomers were right about it from the get-go. What? Boomers have been corrupted by social media as much as any 2 other groups combined. Greg LeMond said in an interview after a race with Lance Armstrong, "If that isn't doping, then Lance is the best in the world." Well, Lance took offense to that, so he completely ruined Greg's career. Trek canceled their endorsement of him and conveniently went straight to Lance. Lance Armstrong is a piece of crap. Hillary Clinton. She's literally on video explaining step by step what would happen if Trump lost the election. She was 100% correct. Don't forget Adam Schiff and Jamie Raskin. During the first impeachment, they both spelled out exactly what Trump would do if he wasn't held accountable for trying to extort the Ukrainian president. They both said he would never honor the results of the 2020 election, and Michael Cohen, who said Trump would do anything to stay in office if he lost. Eisenhower in 1961. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists, and it will persist. Snowden told us how the NSA surveillance programs are targeted at US citizens and no one cared. The year before the Grenfell Tower fire that killed 72 people in the block, Edward Daffarn warned in an online post, "It is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, the KCTMO, and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety legislation that they inflict on their tenants and leaseholders." The hard truth is that Trump tried to warn us about the immediate downturn in our economy and massive inflation if Joe Blow ever took office. Inflation is normal, but the type that you are experiencing now is definitely not normal. Just look at the publicly available information and you'll see for yourself. You may not like mean tweets, secure borders, and cheap gas, but Trump was right. We now have Biden inflation, and that sucks. Are you really going to blame Biden on worldwide inflation? James Lovelock came up with the concept of Gaia, Mother Earth, being one big connected system. Told us we were messing up the planet in the 60s. Fascinating guy. Literally a freelance inventor just coming up with stuff in his shed. I read an interview of him maybe 10 years ago, and he said, "Game's up. Too late. Make hay, we're all fricked," which I sadly agree with. Richard M. Stallman. He's been telling us since 1990 that relying on proprietary software for our devices will lead to inscrutable mass surveillance, loss of understanding of our tools, and removing the ability for anyone to learn to program. Few people listened, and even those people didn't take it very seriously. Now the majority of people under 20 don't even own a computer and do everything on their phone. Tablets, DRM checking hardware chips, and other no-user serviceable parts within tools are replacing general-purpose user-controlled computers, and the future of computing over the next generation looks incredibly grim. Idiocracy, directed by Mike Judge, seems to become truer each year. My wife wrote a paper in 2008 warning about the threat of a global pandemic through a novel coronavirus. That paper has now been cited over 700 times. Jimmy Carter tried to warn people about materialism and the seeming need for more stuff while he was president. Politics overshadowed this message, though. Ludwig von Mises warned us about the negative consequences of surrendering power to the governments. It was even before the First World War and the expansion of communism, and we didn't listen. Martha Mitchell warned everyone that Nixon was a crook before the Watergate story broke. Didn't see anyone mention this, but remember when Romney ran against Obama and said the Russians were the biggest threat to American democracy since the USSR and the Cold War? Obama made fun of him for it to a whole conference of people who laughed along with him. Then Russia invaded Crimea. The very next presidential election in the US saw unprecedented levels of media manipulation coming from, you guessed it, Russian troll farms. Then we learned that Russia basically bankrolls the GOP and everyone forgot about that real quick. Now they're trying to start a war with NATO, already at war with the only state separating the two powers. Mitt Romney was spot on. Russia was the bad guy we were looking for. The Simpsons, about literally everything. John McCain warning the US in 2007 of Russian aggression and that we needed to stomp them. He was criticized at the time for being a Cold War warmonger. I mean, he was, but he was also right on with that one. Trump warned Germany not to depend on Russian electricity and was laughed at. It's kind of different than what you mean, but on the 24th of December 2004, I woke up having the worst nightmare I'd ever had in my life. In the dream, a lot of people were drowning and I was trying to save them, but I couldn't. I was so panicked and overwhelmed, when I woke up I was actually crying and sweating. My parents had to run over to the couch to wake me up from my dream. Apparently I'd been saying, "Move, run," but I didn't remember why. I couldn't shake this horrible feeling for hours and hours, like a sense of deep dread, until finally I moved on with my day. Less than 30 hours later, the Boxing Day tsunami hit where my cousin and her then BF were vacationing. Luckily, she survived because she was high up enough in her hotel. I've never had anything like that happen before or after. Lars Ulrich. We were all angry at the whole Napster thing, but he insisted that this sort of behavior would result in music no longer holding value for people. Since streaming is a thing, most people will think of music as a commodity, not a product. Now people don't buy albums, let alone listen to them. He was right all along, and we weren't ready to understand his concern. Thanks for watching until the end. What have you been trying to warn people about? Tell us about it in the comments below. Then be sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that you know when our next video is available. For more videos like this one, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.